my first question about your visit in Russia. Is this visit first visit?
Yes, it is my first time in Russia.
Could you tell about your first impression about our country?
My first impression, first from the plane I was looking for the sea. I wanted to recognize the shape of the sea with St. Petersburg at the end and Kronstadt. I wanted to see that, but I was on the wrong side of the plane, so I couldn't see it. I was old enough to come to Berlin before the wall fell, and I guess coming to the east side of Europe, I have memories of that time. Driving through the streets of St. Petersburg, I was thinking, are there things left of Leningrad? And so I was looking at the architecture, and I was very interested by the layers of the past. The 19th century, the 18th century, the 20th century. I was surprised to see, to be greeted by Lenin also, because I was wondering whether the statue has always been there, went away, came back. That was the questions I was having.
Okay, and now I will ask you about your academic topics that you study in recent years.
So I did my PhD on Plato, and then in the recent years I worked more and more on pre-Socratics. I guess the reason why I started looking at pre-Socratics, on Plato I worked on activity and passivity. As you know, there are categories of Aristotle's, but I was trying to do the prehistory of action and passion. And looking at it in Plato, I found that the way Plato thinks that bodies can act upon another body, or souls can act upon each other, follow the same kind of rules. So it's as though a physics of the bodies, a physics of the souls in society was there in Plato. And when you're looking at this, well, suddenly you don't really know what nature is about anymore, because if our minds can interact in the way the bodies can interact too, well, there's no difference between, let's say, physics and sociology. So I started looking at the pre-Socratics to find the origins of these conceptions of interactions between souls, between bodies, in previous times.
I know that France is a country of philosophical culture, and I have a question about modern academy of France, how modern scholars of France concerns to the study in the antiquity, culture and philosophy. In other words, what place the studies of the antiquity are holding in the academic world of France?
Something that probably is happening in a lot of countries is that Latin and Greek that were important in high schools before are no longer very important. So to study the ancient times, we need to think that it's something we start at university. We need to build the programs that allow people to discover and get into the Greek or the Latin when they come to university. And there we develop the studies of ancient texts. I think one thing we may be doing better and better is interdisciplinary approaches. So at the same time as we need to start to build the ancient cultures, most of the time from the ground when people reach university. In France, as in other countries in which the classical culture was important, and it has declined in high schools. So that means that the classicists of tomorrow, or the historians of philosophy, that we have to accept that they will probably learn Greek when they come to university. But we can use that loss to create a new background and context of studies where disciplines work more together. So you should be able to hear some history of ancient periods, classics, philosophy, history of science. So maybe we can seize the opportunity of rebuilding from the ground the ancient culture to make it more complete, more interdisciplinary. Sure, the scholars of tomorrow might have a different profile than the scholars of yesterday. Maybe they might do more mistakes in Greek than our predecessors, but they might have a more complete understanding of the different disciplines working in the field of ancient studies. So I guess in France, as in other countries, we need to make that shift and enrich the study of ancient texts in our way.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, has the antiquity philosophy and its study usefulness for modern society?
Well, the study of the past is interesting in itself to give us a sense of relativity of where we stand. We might discover that what we think is new about us is not new, or there are other things that we're not looking at are indeed new. Then, what about the Greeks in particular? Their inspiration can come to us in many ways. First, their attraction to knowledge and techniques, and hence the type of philosophy they gave us. The dialogues of Plato, where Plato makes us see that the experience that humans make of the world is disseminated in a lot of practices, knowledges, techniques, crafts. And that's what humankind does. Trying to understand things, make them work. And then the idea is, when we follow Plato, to try and find a unity of a world disseminated through all kind of knowledge. So, what they teach us is to ask ourselves the questions: were we able today, like Plato did, to try and find the consistency, the unity of all the things we do, we know? Then Plato asked us a further question. The question is, do we make decisions based on our best knowledge? Do we conduct our affairs according to the best knowledge we have of our situation as human beings and as human beings in the universe? And these questions coming from the past, they're interesting for us now. Are we doing this?
Mm-hmm. But we know that some of modern philosophers and in France too think that metaphysics is dead. And they tell us that Plato is icons of metaphysics. And what do you think about it?
I'm not sure they're dead, because it might have. There's a lot of papers being written in metaphysics today, even in Australian universities, where there didn't used to be metaphysics like 500 years ago. So maybe metaphysics has become Australian. But was Plato a metaphysician? to me, he was a Greek thinker, and he was in a tradition of thinking the unity of the world. Of course, there's something we call metaphysics in it, but the unity of the world, of the universe or the cosmos. Plato thought it had a soul that has to think intelligible forms in order for the world to be as it is. So that question is not dead. We're still fighting with that question to understand what order we are in within this universe. What part of this universe we are. That question was the question of the Greeks. And it's a question that philosophy today could still embrace.
You say that Plato found unity of the world.
Unity of
the world.
Yes.
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 But we know that such philosopher as Lyotard tells that big narrative not actual now.
Sure.
And it big narrative creates this unity of the world because we see on the world using our language.
Sure. But okay, there's a difference. Maybe we should differentiate kinds of unity. If you look at the dialogues of Plato, of course, in some dialogues, you will find a big representation of the universe, like in Timaeus. But if you take the dialogues as a whole, as an enterprise of that starts again every time to try and find a way to describe how reality could be organized between different knowledges and practices. Maybe a task for philosophy can be to find that unity, a unity of the unity there is not the unity of things. It can be the unity of the plane where you can see how our different knowledges fit together or don't. But there's still room for that. And even if to describe how it doesn't match, how we can't reconcile our physics with our biology, with our sociology, well, maybe it doesn't fit. But the old Greek task of philosophy as trying to draw the map of how our world looks, whether it's a puzzle.
And I have a question about your presentation on the conference.
Yeah.
Could you tell about it?
I'm going to present something on Plato's dialogue Ion. And I chose the subject because Lorenzo Ferroni and I, together, just did an edition of Plato's Ion in French. Lorenzo did a new Greek text, which we don't do often, so that's maybe the most interesting part of our book. I did a new translation based on his new text, and then I did a running commentary. It's not a French tradition to do running commentaries, it's more an English one, and so we don't do a lot of them, and it was really pleasant to do it. So what I'm going to develop about it is the kind of new strategies we developed reading it. So it's a small dialogue where Socrates meets a rhapsode, Ion. We don't know if he existed or if Plato invented it. But what is exciting about this very short dialogue is that first, if I take this interdisciplinary approach, and I think that's one of the strategies we used. Well, the Ion is like it might sound realistic if I say that, but it's like a window or a testimony open on the practice of the ancient rhapsodes. We don't have many testimonies. And even if it's a fictive dialogue, even if Plato invents Ion, he tells us about the way he thought of the practice of the rhapsode. So we learned about what a rhapsode claimed to be able to do. So that's the Plato perspective of asking people what they know, the Socratic perspective. So a rhapsode thinks that of course he knows by heart Homer, but then he thinks he's the best at commenting it. And Socrates challenges this. So what we try to do with this small dialogue is so to look at it from all the possible angles: history, anthropology, history of music. We wanted to give it the best context, historical context. And that's how I think then you can go back to philosophy. Because the problem with sometimes the dialogues of Plato, like the Ion, is that its case has been already judged by the historians of philosophy. Ion has to be a dialogue on Plato and art and condemnation of poetry, and poetry cannot have any kind of wisdom or knowledge. And yes, there's a bit in the dialogue where if it's not allowed knowledge, then it could be inspiration, and we have a great bit on inspiration. But to renew the reading of the dialogue, so that's why we needed the context, to see that Plato is doing more subtle things with the rhapsodes. For instance, if you read carefully the Ion, you see that he looks at the different things that a rhapsode thinks he's doing. Sometimes it's about the recitation, sometimes it's about the commentary. And then you can ask yourselves, did a rhapsode do these two things at the same time in the same circumstances? And it's unlikely that we hear that a rhapsode would come for the Panathenaec festival. And Plato gives us a number. 20,000 people are listening to him. And there's this beautiful page of the Ion where he says that when he's on the bema, on the scene, talking, recitating, he has 20,000 people are shivering if the scene is frightening, or they're weeping if it's sad. So that's one thing he's doing, but at the same time he says I could do wise commentaries of Homer better than Metrodorus of Lampsacus, than the everyday commentators of the time. And that is certainly not doing at the very moment he is in front of 20,000 people. They would be bored, they would leave. So if we follow that thread, we can see that Plato is telling us about another kind of practice that the rhapsode had. Probably meeting between rhapsodes, competing, quoting and then explaining the text, competing in knowledge. And so that's probably, if you read the Ion that way, you can see at the end that Socrates and Ion are doing that. They're quoting and they're trying to be the best at explaining the text. So the dialogue shows you new curves and meanders when we are questioning about recitating, we're questioning about commenting, we're trying to understand it in the framework of the Panathenaec festival, but then there's the Dionysiac inspiration that comes in, as if we were going to the Dionysus festival. So if you come up with all the context, you get a rich understanding of the dialogue, and that's what I was saying to begin with.
To present a new edition of Ion, and I want to ask you about new editions of Plato in France. What do you think about it? How often should be such edition printed and etc.
For the French translation, then you should interview Luc Brisson. In French, we had Victor Cousin in the 19th century, then many editions. But I guess the people who did the whole thing, we had Léon Robin, of course, but nobody did the whole thing alone, I think. And then you have the Garnier-Flammarion, so you have the Budé translations, but it's not complete. How is it? No. Oh, it will? It was. And now we have the Garnier-Flammarion. The Garnier-Flammarion, the last 20 years, is very useful too. So I think we had a major translation every maybe 30 years, 20, 30 years in French. And this one was interesting because, of course, you have the introductions, the notes, the bibliography, so that needed to be redone. It's a translation that corresponds to the standards of today in terms of clarity and precision. It's accessible. It's like pocket editions that all the students can have. So, yeah. And it will need to be redone at some point, but now we can maybe rest for a while.
Imagine that you can influence on the rule or on the government. How do you see the sphere of the antiquity philosophy studies now? And what do you want to change in this sphere?
Well, what I was saying to start with is that we need more interaction between history, classics, philosophy. So that's one thing we need to change. We need to create institute of classical studies where the historian of science, the historian of philosophy, the classicist and the historians work together. We need to do that more, I think. Another important thing is that we need to keep the quality of these studies everywhere in all our universities to make the ancient studies accessible. At the moment in France, with things like the Shanghai ranking of universities, there's a desperate move to make a new competition between our universities, where you have universities with more money, universities with less money, buying bigger professors on the mercato as if it was football. And that's a danger, I think, to keep the quality of all universities where they are, so that anyone from any region, any part of the country can access to the best education in ancient studies. Since ancient studies is a precise and maybe small in the eyes of our policymakers subject, there can be a temptation to make it accessible only in a few places. One could say in France, for instance, okay, you want to study ancient Greek, you all go to Paris, or you all go to wherever you want people to be sent. And that would be the biggest threat that I think we're facing. We need to have an interdisciplinary approach, and we need to have it accessible everywhere. And then we need to make these centers communicate between themselves, organize conferences together. So if I was Ministry of Research, I would do that.
Okay. How do you see a future of the classical studies, of studies in the antiquity?
The future?
Future. How do you see?
How do I see it? Well, I would like to see it as just described. Now, it might not go that way. It might just happen that it only remains in a few places with a good standard. I'd rather it didn't happen like that, but it might. We've been through that kind of times. early Middle Ages, where you could only study Greek in Western Europe in some monastery in Ireland, or we've been through this. It's not good. So I hope the future of ancient studies is a future where Greek and Latin are accessible, made accessible for all the students who want to start, whatever their age. Or even people, there was this idea that if you hadn't studied Greek when you were young, you would never manage Greek. It's not true. You can start Greek when you're 30 and master it. So we need to make it accessible. We need to make the boundaries between it, the walls around it fall. And so that might mean that we need to make classic studies accessible to students who are studying other subjects. Make it welcoming. So I hope it will be like that.
And a last question. Please wish something to Russian colleagues.
Oh, what? Well, first I have to get to know them. That's why I'm here. So I hope for them that they have all the freedom and budget also to go on studying ancient studies, have room for PhD students, PhD programs. That's what I wish for them, to have everything it takes to study the ancient text.
Okay, thank you for the interesting conversation.
Thank you.